we've engaged around this work we have done on the economic geography of Delhi NCR. I remember Jagan, of course, provided us very valuable comments when we were in draft stage. Rana, we've had a few conversations around this with, it's great for us. It's taken a while. Nilesh also we engaged with to put it out. And so with that, really, I welcome you to this conversation on the economic geography approach to planning and what are its implications for planning. We've tried to put certain views, but would love to also hear your thoughts. Rajat will, of course, share the presentation. Just to acknowledge everyone who's in the room, especially so Dr. O.P. Agarwal, our former boss, and O.P. of course, O.P. was very much a part of this whole project when we were developing it and framing it. Professor Kundu, who's been sort of our guru through this process and also making sure we've been statistically relevant and correct through the process. It's been it. Jagan Shah, he's now a senior fellow at Artha Global and someone we've interacted with over the years. Rana, who's currently the director at Development Economics and Indicators Division of ADB, but also very, very engaged and interested in this topic. Ms. Parul Agarwal, country manager at UN Habitat, and last Nilesh, who's the program director of Urban Strategy Unit at NIUA. But all of you are friends and collaborators from the past. So welcome again, and really look forward to hearing your thoughts on actually what do we do with this, right? We've gotten there, we've spent a lot of time trying to do this. Is this meaningful, and then how can this really further this agenda of bringing together economic development and urban planning as we think about our urban areas. So with that, over to you, Rajat.
Thank you, Madhav. We'll provide a brief summary of the publication that we are about to release. This is, of course, an economic geography approach to plan for India's urban growth. The publication is titled Morphology of Delhi National Capital Region's Economic Geography and its Implications for Planning. Most of you are familiar of the Delhi National Capital Region, but I'm just going to set context before we get into some of the findings. What you see at the core in yellow is where we are sitting in Delhi. This is the National Capital Territory. But also the city has grown over time. It has extended urban agglomerations into, as we know, Gurgaon, Faridabad, Noida, Great Noida, Ghaziabad. So that's the extended agglomeration which we're calling as the Central National Capital Region. And then there's the rest, which is surrounded by, of course, the states of Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, Haryana. That's the rest of the region, largely rural, with smaller cities. This is the context we're talking about. Our interest is, of course, we understand that this region is politically diverse, jurisdictionally different, but yet it is all interconnected economically, because there's an economic integration between the core, periphery, and region. This is well recognized and evidenced in global context, and we're going to test that in the Indian context as well. Some numbers, of course, this is the primate economic agglomeration of India. This is sort of the national economic capital, not only just the national capital. About 370 billion USD is the numbers we have for 2015 for this region. The sort of issue that we face in the Indian context is that while urban planning and land use planning has found its way in our acts for over 100 years now, economic development planning never got mainstreamed. There are some policies that come in. I'm talking about city regions, so it's a very urban focused economic development strategy we're talking about. This has not been mainstreamed. Wherever you see it, it's a bit prescriptive, not dynamic. Like the NCR itself has a functional plan for economic development released once in 20 years. And not really, participative industry participation, all of that is sort of missing. So we're looking at this, and the study examines different aspects. One is, of course, the industrial structure of NCR. How has that evolved over time? We have data from 1991, that's just at liberalization, till 2013-14. We look at efficiency of the industries in this region, what transformation happened between the core, periphery, and the region, and some of the demographic associated impacts that we have seen. Coming right to it, so this is the picture of the jobs in this region. Like I mentioned, data from 1990 till 2013-14, you can see a diverse mix of industry within the Delhi NCR. This is the entire NCR as a whole. We're looking at the growth of jobs and which sectors have grown and not. Trade, for example, becoming the dominant, Delhi is sort of the capital of trade for entire North India. So you can see a bulk of people really, employed in the trade sectors. Agriculture in the region continuing to grow because there's a lot of demand for urban consumption. So you can see from 1990, the green sort of bars are continuing to grow in terms of agricultural products. Others that continue to stay. So for example, the manufacturing band of textile products, electrical, optical, basic metals, fabricated metals, all of that continuing quite steadily. The manufacturing sector has been fairly steady. So this is sort of the growth you see over time. The same is summarized here. It is a good mix of various diverse types of industries. Expected, sort of growth. I mean, you don't see any surprises as such at the NCR level. And we mentioned, so growth in certain sectors. This is how those sectors play out when it comes to contribution to GDP. So while agriculture, and in this particular graph, we've brought in the laborers as well. It was not there in the establishments chart earlier. But here you have the actual farm labor and all of that. So clearly the employment very high because of our rural larger region. But the contribution to GDP very low when it comes to the agricultural sector. So it employs, it's labor intensive, but not contributing to GDP. Manufacturing, of course, sort of largely stable at around 30% of GDP, 30% of jobs. So that continues largely stable. The services, of course, as we talk of in this context, really contributing to GDP, giving high numbers, but not employing that many people. So this is sort of the aspect of jobs and contribution to GDP. When it comes to this region, what does Delhi NCR specialize in when compared to the rest of India? That was a quick check we did. So this is, of course, surprising considering we are the national capital. We are continuing to specialize in low-value manufacturing. So there's, rubber, plastic, metal, electrical, optical equipment. These are the sort of industries that we're continuing to be more competitive in. And not, you might expect ITS, business services, management consulting. That's really not peaking in this region as of now at an NCR scale. In fact, some of these sectors like business services have actually declined in their primacy. So that's something to note in this region. When you come to industry efficiency, so we looked at efficiency parameters like, labor intensiveness, output of industry, energy intensiveness. So what we find in this region, and this is, a picture of NCR's industries, we find that the overall employment structure has improved when it comes to industrial output. So we are being more productive in terms of the mix of industries that are there in this region. Improved labor productivity, so that actually indicates a lot of capital intensiveness because we're actually being more productive per person. However, when it comes to technical efficiency and energy efficiency, we're not growing in those sectors. So not the most, energy conservative in that sense. After looking at, the whole of NCR across its industrial structure, efficiencies, and type of employment structures, we will now look at a disaggregated scale because we saw the whole of the NCR. But the moment you start zooming into where the real agglomeration is and where the jobs concentrate, you'll see that there's a clear, outward growth. It's shown both in built-up area as well as in night lights. The built-up area, you can see, this larger patch at the bottom is really Gurgaon. It boomed post the 90s, really capturing sort of the higher-end tertiary services like ITS, business consulting services, etc. All of that came in this area. The airport also came up in this area. You are seeing sort of outward growth and the night lights reflecting that as well. You can see a clear, growth of night lights towards the peripheries and along the corridors. So this kind of a pattern is seen. When we correlate this with jobs, you can see from the core, this is the center of the core, this is 0 to 10 kilometers from the center of Delhi till, going out to about 200-kilometer radius outside of Delhi. So you'll see a clear concentration of tertiary sector activities within Delhi core and manufacturing, so both very strong. And then sort of that taper out till about 40 kilometers outside from the center of Delhi, you'll see a fair diversity, and then it just tapers off into a more rural region as you go outwards. And that's why when you look at it from a farm labor, all of that, that will really peak in the peripheries. Here is the same mapping, but spatially now. Very clear concentrations and clusters of jobs, right? When we look at this, the blue hues that you see are the tertiary sector jobs. The yellow to brown hues are really the manufacturing jobs. So you can see where they're concentrating. Clearly, this is the national capital. It has very high levels of infrastructure investments like metro rail. It is the 5th largest network in the world, for example, in terms of metro rail. Proactive investments have been coming in by the adjoining states, whether it's a Noida, Great Noida. These are all planned developments coming in around Delhi, very smartly done because it's captured the growth of Delhi in that sense. And hence you see that economic activity really moving out and along, of course, arterial corridors for the need of access. So it clearly shows that it's not a homogeneous region. It cannot be expected to be either. And it also shows you that no two places are alike. They are very specific kind of jobs, specific kind of clusters that are occurring in this region. This is then, of course, some of the surprises when you start disaggregating by geography. The moment you look at the core versus the periphery that we spoke of and the region, there's a big movement in terms of the jobs. So, for example, if you look more closely, the blue in the 1990s, so that's sort of the 4th bar in the colors. I think it's looking a little purple here. It had the maximum number of jobs in the 1990s. This is Delhi NCT. And as you can see, over time, it's starting to decrease and then go into a negative growth rate. So the core of Delhi is actually losing out a lot of jobs to the peripheries. And at the same time, the orange bar that you see, which is CNCR, the central NCR, that's Gurgaon, Faridabad, Noida, that whole area, you can see a boom in jobs. It's really growing while the core, so it's sort of capturing that growth and continuing to the region also growing. So the rural region, like I mentioned, is growing in terms of agricultural productivity. They have to service this large agglomeration. As many of us know, the Delhi agglomeration is going to be the largest in the world in this decade. So really that consumption demand very high, the region providing for it. This is a slight specialization of the same thing. It just shows what is really prime to the core, periphery and the region. So, in terms of actually continuing to grow. So when we look at the core, we are seeing that while trade, for example, is dominant in the core, it's declining in terms of share of employment. So is post and telecommunication. What's really growing is rubber, plastic, metal, fabricated metal. It continues to have high growth rates. These are the ones that have lesser contribution to GDP, higher employment, and higher growth rate. So that's interesting that the core continues to be low value, manufacturing. The periphery, which is CNCR periphery, actually specializing in business services. So they are capturing that higher knowledge jobs. The rest of the region, as we know, more prime in terms of agriculture, etc. So these are some interesting facets when you start, disaggregating by core, periphery, region. All of this growth, since we've studied, it's almost 25 years of job transitions where we've looked at, you'll see that the transformation has also had associated impacts on demography, that's on the people. For example, when you look at population migration, overall there is a decline. We know that our fertility rates are starting to decline. So overall there's a decline in terms of population and migration. However, between the core, periphery and region, it's clearly the periphery that is actually capturing not only more population, but it's also capturing the educated migrant. They are preferring to settle in the peripheries. The jobs are also preferring to settle in the peripheries. So these are clear ideas. And the skilled migrants also going to the region. The region, of course, having the more low-skilled migrants. When we checked migration patterns, it is the unskilled sort of labor, on farms, etc., really going to the region, which is also seeing growth. When it comes to other aspects, for example, per capita income, this has tripled in the region. When per capita income has tripled, so has poverty levels. It has declined sharply. So in fact, we have numbers of poverty rate declining from 24% to 9%. It's a big decline. Consumption also a lot higher than the rest of India. It's almost 50% higher than the national consumption rates. Credit deposit ratio is also much higher. This is good. The banks are using their money well in this region. So credit deposit ratios are also here. Some of the downsides of this growth has been unemployment rates. Like I said, services coming in to bring in your GDP, but not necessarily bringing in the jobs. So unemployment rates continuing to rise, much faster, of course, in certain areas versus the other. Female work participation rates declining in this region. So women are not coming out to work, despite, and our analysis is showing women are much more educated in this region now. They're also having lower fertility rates. They're having less children, but yet not coming out into the workforce. So that's again an area of concern. Marginalized groups. So we looked at SC, ST, OBC, all of these groups as well. While they are able to participate in terms of ownership of establishments, what we're seeing is that they continue to be employed in elementary jobs. So that's more like hand tool based jobs. They're not really getting into the higher value knowledge economy jobs. So we're seeing some of these aspects as well. We also did a number of case studies to see that if this is what the region is going through in this country, we also looked at other case studies. So we looked at many international case studies, and we've seen that there are certain patterns that successful regions have adopted. One, they consistently plan for economic development. It is not reactive or left to chance or left to the market. They're consistently planning for it. So there's, periodic economic development strategies that are created. Many of them, of course, run by mayors. We're also seeing state and non-state actors. So it's not just government, but with government, there is the private sector, industry associations, people in terms of their skill levels. Everybody's participating in the economic development process so that there are better synergies and there's tandem. Strategic projects, I remember Parul mentioning acupuncture projects in the day. Strategic planning and strategic projects forming a key component of remaining competitive, bringing in innovation, and continuing to improve your employment outcomes, employment densities, etc. Again, done in many contexts. And of course, strategic projects are also ensuring private investment is coming in. They're crowding in private investment with public investment. So, reaching much higher impact. So some of these learnings also we saw. And to summarize, this is the second last slide. What we've seen is that an economic geography approach is able to inform the planning process better because it is spatial in nature. It's actually able to tell you where, what is happening, that no two places are alike, etc. And it seems to inform the dynamic nature of cities, core, periphery, region, all these are transforming, can inform it better. It's also able to give place-specific strategies and processes that will consider where firms are located, where is clustering, what is their transformation over time, and the impact it has on people's lives. So this is the last sort of recommendations and way forward. One, like I mentioned, we do not have an economic development process for our cities, so bringing in, possibly at the NCR scale, an economic development corporation. They have been able to do it in terms of transport. There's an NCRTC in place. Can they have an NCR EDC, like an economic development corporation? That would be somebody that then coordinates all of this economic development. At the same time, while that's at the regional scale, the cities also need to do something. So the Delhi core that we've seen are clearly declining despite high infrastructure levels. What can be done for that? A core revitalization strategy, again seen in many contexts globally. Mega city regions do end up hollowing out and then building themselves back out. How do we look at that for the city? Spatio-economic assessments for large infrastructure projects. If you are putting in infrastructure like say an RRDS or like mega projects, airports coming in the region, for example, this can be far more targeted because through an economic geography approach, you know where growth dynamism is. So you're targeting the right places. These places will grow. Your investment will grow as well. So how do you target investments better? Similarly, bringing in foreign direct investment, bringing it to dynamic locations, bringing in private sector to the same location. So you all co-invest and crowdfund these kind of locations. And the last is, of course, inclusion. We're trying to see how the marginalized groups can come up from elementary jobs. Do they require skilling? Is it better education, social facilities? All of those aspects coming in would definitely build a better economy in this region. Thank you very much. Thank you. That was just a summary of our publication. But to move into the sort of round with the experts at the table, I'm of course surrounded by the co-authors of the report. So it's Professor Kundu here, Madhav here, Raj Bhagat, Tintu, Paramjit. So yeah, it's been a large effort to pull this together. and a large team with great input. But to start the discussion, I'll definitely go to OP sir, because you were there at the conceptualization of our economic geography work at WRI. And so you're also at the Niti Ayog today as an advisor. Economic development seems to have finally come to the forefront. At least there's a recognition it needs to be done. It'll be great to hear from you, sir. What do you feel is the future of this? Is this something of interest to the Niti Ayog? Where do we see some of this going? Thank you.
I just want to recall something that I said again in the morning in a conversation that I was having with Madhav when this work was going on. And my question to Madhav was, what would be your indicator of success of this report? And what he said to me was something that hit me very hard and very powerfully. I think the very interesting thing he said is, if the Ministry of Urban Development can decide that they would have similar economic geography reports prepared for multiple regions in the country, we would feel happy that we've shown the way. I think that is exactly what he said, and that's what sort of really hit me strongly. I think that's what's happened. It may not have happened in the ministry, but I think it's much better that it's happened in Niti. Because what the ministry could do is bring together different parts of their ministry. But something of this sort needs to bring together many others. You know, part of the discussion in the Niti Ayog also has been that if this work is to be led by a ministry, which one should it be? And the thinking is, should it be industries? Should it be, some other ministry? But urban has a limited role in this. It's really facilitating the growth. So I think, it's phenomenal that this report has come out. I'm really happy this has come out, because without this, I haven't seen anything else that has tried to link the two of them together. So I think it's very useful. The Niti Ayog is finding it very useful. Today, what the Niti Ayog is trying to do is to look at a kind of a framework on which we can move ahead with developing the growth hubs that they want to develop. And I think you provided that framework. So I think it's very useful. Let me stop with that for now and then.
I will go to Jagan next. Jagan was also a reviewer of this publication along with Rana. Jagan, you've also reviewed the review. You've been one of our external reviewers as well, so you're quite aware of the nature of this report. And you also understand the process of decision making, the way it's done, within government. Do you see the principles of, economic geography approaches and economic development as being important for urban planning, to inform urban planning? And just good to hear from you. You've also recently brought out a report on green growth. So does this kind of an approach sort of benefit some of these other aspects as well, urban growth as well as green growth? Yeah.
Thanks, Rajit. I couldn't agree with OP more. The time has come for us to really lock in this as being sort of the dominant paradigm by which we look at development in general and urban, regional, provincial development in appropriate ways. So, the answer to your question, Rajit, is yes, of course. I think there are, and this is reflecting now, sort of partly in hindsight, some of the things which perhaps I didn't sort of pick up when I read previous drafts. And partly because I've just returned this morning after a week in the Netherlands, where I was exposed to the impact of social housing and the availability of social housing to the job market and to economic development in general. In rapidly growing cities like Vienna in Austria, for instance, Eindhoven in the Netherlands, which is completely transforming its economy away from being the center where Philips was located and some particular kinds of industries were located, and now to a more sort of brain power center. And the pivotal role that social housing plays in that. And the fact that social housing corporations and non-profit social housing corporations actually dominate the supply of housing. So this might be tangential, but I actually feel that some of the findings of this report seem to hint at the housing crisis being somewhat a determinant of the way in which the economic geography plays out as well. So the distance from the core, for instance, the particular point about the marginalized groups concentrated in elementary occupations, but also likely now if we see it in the light of the recent study done by Paul Novosad and others on discrimination in housing supply, one begins to sort of piece together a picture where there is an exclusion of workers as well at a fairly large scale, and that leading to, in a sense, a constraining of growth. So I think we have to place housing very much at the center of this, and nobody better than Professor Kundu can shed light on this even more. So perhaps a follow-up study of another region that factors housing in far more significantly. I think the idea of governance, I think you asked the question about governance and how to manage this. Clearly, this is not something which even a national capital region corporation can do, an SPV of sorts. We need to reimagine governance at a scale where, Rajit, you yourself are involved in Uttar Pradesh with the conversation on divisional commissioners and divisions and regions really becoming jurisdictions as well. That seems to be the way forward. We, Artha Global contributed a little bit to that, to Mr. Keshav Verma's approach on divisional commissioners. And we feel very strongly that we need to rethink jurisdictions that can actually address this particular need. So cities and city governments, and you mentioned mayors, for instance, seem completely marginal to the overall scale. And in fact, interesting what OP just said about the Ministry of Urban Development being perhaps not that significant, partly because those units of governance and those units of activity perhaps are not sufficient for us to rethink regions, which seems to be the need of the hour. So I'll also just pause there and hopefully come back later.
Thank you, Jagan. I'll go to Rana now. Rana has also been an external reviewer for us. Also, Rana, we are aware that along with the Niti Aayog, you had done a report related to cities as engines of economic growth. And you also had the opportunity through that to interview multiple stakeholders, I believe over 130 possibly. It would be great to hear some feedback from that process that you did, as well as any on this report's usefulness. Yeah.
Great report. I think seeing more reports like this for different cities in India is really the way to go. And so I was really happy when I heard that Niti is taking this up, actually. And with their 4 pilots, etc. Just a few quick thoughts initially. Just first on data, I'm so glad that you actually took this economic census data and merged it with this other types of data, nighttime lights, etc., built up area. It's really an underutilized resource, and at the same time, we know that it has qualities, but I think when we start just getting into data quality issues and not use obvious data sets that are out there and which can be used with care, we do a real disservice to the data. So really glad you used it. And anyone trying to replicate this for other cities, you mentioned Paul Novostat's work, so Shrugs, they've done a great job. They've actually put up all this stuff on they've gone from the economic census 1990, they've got these geographical units tied up, and I think this kind of work can really be replicated much faster now, thanks to that effort. So that's just a plug on data. On our own work, and that's where I think it ties in with yours. The issue comes up: why cities, right? And maybe I don't need to belabor the point, but ultimately, from just an economic framework, capital we know is mobile. It goes wherever it needs to. People are not as mobile, and so. Yes, there's migration, but fundamentally people are never going to be as mobile as capital. And so who else other than people in cities and around cities who have the most stake in making sure their locations are good places to work? And so that then, you go to that canonical example of the Chinese city mayor, like the CEO's one objective is to bring jobs and investments to the city. But then you look at our situation completely opposite. And here I agree with Jagan, that because our system is so different, the city mayors, etc., they just don't have That's not in their mandate. And so we have to think, who has that mandate? My own guess, after having worked a little bit on this, is actually maybe it should be the industries department folks. Because ultimately, industries, yeah, there are industries in rural areas, but for the most part, industries want to be located near vibrant cities. And so in our study, when we talked to the the stakeholders, the essential question was put to people that, okay, look, what attracts you here? If you're thinking of moving, why? And so, the response is very logical. It's basically that, look, firms require a lot of public inputs to not only operate but thrive. And these public inputs are provided by many, many different agencies. Sometimes it's central, sometimes it's state. At the state level, so many different agencies get into the act. Nobody there to coordinate. And that's why we thought of this idea, this thing called the City Economic Council, what you're thinking about the corporation. We didn't want to get into the framework. Should it be a statutory body? What type of body should it be? How does it link up with the district magistrate, etc.? Those are thorny questions, but I do think focusing on those questions is really the right thing to do, because devil is in the details. So I'll just stop for now. One last pitch for future work is transport and land use work. Madhav, and we've had this discussion on Bangalore Metro, and I was so struck by the charts Madhav showed to me about why, we're spending crores on metro systems. And for the metro systems to have the real bang, you need that land use policy, and you need those secondary, tertiary road networks. So just a plug for any future work you do on this, please, the transport and land use side, please bring that in. Thank you.
Thank you, Rana. I'd like to go to Parul from UN Habitat. Parul, I believe you also worked in New York, on its local economic development planning. What are some of the key learnings, from your experience there, and how can it inform our conditions here in India?
All right, no, thanks. Thank you so much, and already very interesting discussion. So I thought I'll reflect on my work with working with New York City planning and how we interacted with the NYC Economic Development Corporation, which kind of goes into this whole fundamental of basic understanding that let's look at the whole region, New York, New Jersey, Newark, Long Island, as a region that not only has certain comparative advantages when we look at the global impact of that region, but then also built in this sense of competition between the cities, and which is where I want to share some examples of how planning is so important in influencing the cities and their competitive geography. So when I was there, this was 2008, 2009, we were going through a big financial crisis. The Economic Development Corporation was given a mandate that we need to stay competitive globally. How can we hedge our bets? The financial sector is moving out. What do we do with this building stock? Wall Street is getting empty. And this is where I agree with you, Rana, that we need to look at an economic development corporation that is not a political entity, because they set the vision. They said that, well, the future is in biotech. Can we look at healthcare, but not healthcare in a medical term, but from the research angle, high-tech healthcare, which could utilize this building stock that we have in the Wall Street, which is already fully equipped. What are other industries, which can thrive, which can then understanding the agglomeration economies, that these industries, we need to bring them up to a point where they can specialize, and then they can move out to an intermediary town where the economies of scale, your factors of production, the cost inputs matter. But then they need to be in an agglomeration where they can leverage the innovations that are coming up in other sectors to continue to innovate themselves. And I think that is the role that an economic development corporation can play in India. You have very well pointed out that if we are growing, but we are growing in a low value manufacturing, is that the future? Will that make us a 5 trillion economy aspiration that we have? And what is that course correction that is needed to set the vision right? Set up an entity that can influence the decisions by various ministries, by various actors. I want to just share some thoughts into how then, as a young planner, I saw that economic vision get translated into the planning itself. So one was certainly through land use. How are we putting the land use, but then the granularity and the level of detail, because nothing in these cities was an accident. So not just in large-scale zoning of certain types of manufacturing, but even down to the point of view of how much square footage each entity, each shop gets on a street. So on a 400-foot block, we were looking at requirements that every shop would get only a 20 to 40 feet frontage, because you could have multiple shops. That would mean influencing the local economy, giving more smaller shop owners, more better employment opportunities that would then meet their sort of revenue cycles. Again, playing a cop, because that also meant that your banks, it was easier now to set up ATMs on the ground floor. So again, changing the zoning code and saying, well, ATMs are not allowed. They can go on the first floor, but the ground floor retail will be for the shop fronts. And to the level of detail of the transparency of your windows was also controlled. So nothing is an accident when we go and walk in these cities. And that is where the granularity of planning, your zoning and urban design matters, because when people are walking the street, it's an attractive environment, they spend more, they go to more shop fronts, more coffee shops. Last thought on the acupuncture projects, also that the investments that the city was making was not necessarily in an economic activity. It was just improving the public, amenities, a park, making the Times Square just pedestrian. And that influenced the type of economic activity that the private sector put in, because they could see the benefit of having more foot traffic. So I think the cities should also look into what type of acupuncture projects, create more public assets, more public spaces, more museums, institutional, community amenities, which then, when they're done well, attract private sector, because then they could see the value of coming in and attracting additional funds. I'll be happy to also share another study on that we did to leverage this, the investments that were going into the economic development freight corridor, the Eastern Dedicated Freight Corridor connecting UP. And a lot of lessons on how the land use and the connections to that corridor can be leveraged. So again, investments in an infrastructure can influence the growth of smaller towns by putting the right or setting the economic strategy right, essentially. So again, I think that is where the lacunae of not having economic strategy for these smaller towns that are 100 or 50 kilometers from this dedicated corridor will hurt them in the long run if they do not invest in the right type of infrastructure. So it's a good, really glad that WRI has taken the effort in looking at this study.
Thank you, Parul. Coming to Nilesh. Nilesh, you were also, sort of the project coordinator for the Delhi Master Plan, and I think you just concluded the U20 Technical Secretariat as well, which you played a key role. Starting with, of course, Delhi, since you worked on the Delhi Master Plan, you must have seen some of these, things playing out in Delhi in terms of derelict industrial areas. I think another 99 industries got banned from operating here because of pollution reasons. Industrial policy not revised, the Delhi state industrial policy. So what has been your thinking around all of this, and what would be the way forward? I mean, what have you thought about the core?
Look, one of the things that we wanted to do as part of the plan, I don't think it finally got into the draft plan, because as you all know, it's a process of negotiation, was to set up an entity for Delhi which could think through economic planning for Delhi. Fell through the cracks, didn't really go through. But I think your report points that out in the study, and I think it's absolutely critical that that happens, because a lot of the spatial strategies, including catalytic projects, including loosening the grip on a lot of the regulatory systems that Delhi traditionally has on in terms of land control, land use control, etc. All of those things were done, but if they're not kind of complemented with an economic policy, then one has to wait for the market to take over completely, and that can go in many ways. Having said that, the other suggestion that the report makes, one really wonders when one talks about a regional economic entity. it may work for other regions, which are single state regions, but for a region like Delhi, which has multiple states involved, see, the transport plan is very easy to implement simply because there's something in it for everyone.
Right. Just one project. It's not a larger transport.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a project which everybody got interested in and it could be taken off. When it comes to economic strategy, it's really, everybody's trying to maximize their state's interest, and to have a common policy that kind of speaks to everyone might be a little difficult. It might be easier to have conversations around economy, translate them to infrastructure requirements, and then coordinate at that level, possibly. So that's one thought. To come back to the study, first of all, congratulations. I think it's a great study. A few desires, if not laments, was what ends up happening with studies like this, particularly with metropolitan areas, is that the conversation flips back to the core periphery conversation, which is that the core is hollowing out, there's a periphery that's taking over, how do we then revitalize the core? What one misses out is that there is this entire spate of urbanization happening within the periphery, which has its own spatiality that's emerging. And it would have been absolutely brilliant to see a part 2, and maybe that is part 2, where one is beginning to see what is this really, this kind of spatiality that is emerging within the rest of the region, and how does one begin to unpack or plan for what we otherwise call peri-urban areas, areas that are not really, governance-wise very powerful, but which are seeing extreme and very rapid transformation. So that was one. Second is, I think Jagan brought up the question of at what scale are we really thinking about this? And I think division, district become interesting points at which to make this conversation, also because data is really available here. A lot of data, good data on economic movements, etc. is available, and it's also it's again then a question of who's really looking at it, and that remains a governance question. If one is talking about a district, who's really going to look at that data? What kind of spatial plans are emerging? But I think district or divisions as a critical element in thinking about the spatial patterns that are emerging are very critical. What it also allows you to do is to zoom out a bit. So one is to zoom in and look at districts, etc. But to also zoom out and see that you mentioned nightlight imagery, for instance. And you're realizing that the kind of urbanization we are seeing are not only transcending city boundaries, they're transcending state boundaries. How do you begin to re-look at clusters that are emerging? Those clusters may be way beyond the traditional regional boundaries that we've mapped out. So how do we begin to unpack that? Maybe district becomes that core through which to begin to rethink how that is really happening. So it might be interesting to think about maybe a national diagnostics that's looking at spatializing a lot of the economic data that's available. The last is really, I think again, kudos. Spatialization of economic data is, I think, a great effort. Would really like to see a part 2 where one is able to zoom into some of these areas and see what does this spatialization actually look like, because it's still a whole lot of blobs that make a lot of macro sense to you, of course. But it's really what's really happening at the ground, what kind of clusters are emerging, does it kind of marry the infrastructure that's available in those areas, becomes, I think, questions that we really so.
Thank you. Yeah. In fact, being on data is right here, Rajpalan. So the data is actually mapped down to the street address level. So, but of course, getting to that scale would be also. I'd also request my co-authors, your mother, with Professor Kuru to make a few points. Madam, I'll come to you, Professor. First. Yeah.
Thank you, Vijay. National Capital Region is the vibrant economy that over the past 3 decades has followed a roadmap development which is efficient, which is dynamic, means taking sectors which are growing naturally, and also inclusive in terms of attracting migrants from not only within the regions area, which, by the way, is not the case for many other state capital cities. If you look at the 24 metro cities, top metro cities, you find 22 of them, the rate of growth of population has gone down, migration rate has gone down, very migration. But within NCR as a whole, you find that it has a trend. So it has been inclusive post. Now this conclusion, which was coming out of the presentation, really succinctly put by Rajiv, doesn't come from a literature survey. It comes from, as Nilesh pointed out, Indian zooming in. We're looking at the not only district level data, but also block level data. You have 4 states, and the district boundaries keep on changing. The new districts are emerging. Income data at the district level are non-comparable. There are information available from one state which is different from the another state. I must really compliment Chintu's Party, Karanjit and Raj, give extensive data analysis, exactly the way in which you talked about, so that we could add up the income figures. There is no estimate of national capital regions' income available, except what we did with some amount of approximation. So this conclusion is not a simple statement that, well, it's a vibrant economy, it has grown rapidly, efficiently. The detailed analysis really brings that out. But what surprises me, reminds me of this Alice in Wonderland. There's a statement saying that as you run faster, you remain at the same place. NCR has grown so rapidly. And then what struck us is that as far as the macroeconomic sectoral structure is concerned for NCR, has remained more or less the same. There have been changes. The economic geography approach brings out that there have been very rapid changes in the core, in the inner periphery and the outer periphery. But as far as the overall economic structure is concerned, of course, in some cases there's a mismatch between income share and employment share. For example, agriculture's employment share has gone up, but agriculture, employment share has gone up, but income share has gone down. But nonetheless, overall structure, by and large, remains similar. That is something very important. And we really wanted to find out exactly what's happening. When a city economy grows, the land values change. Metros come in, various other transport arrangements come in. And as a result of this change, what happens? The land-intensive industry tend to move out. The traditional industries move out. They get kicked out of that whole region. And that creates crisis. Ahmedabad, Calcutta, most of the large cities in Uttar Pradesh, they have short-term crisis because of the changing dynamics of land and other factors. You find that the old traditional industries get kicked out. What happened in NCR? We find this has not happened to that extent. They have moved out of the core, but they have remained within the NCR region. For example, we talked about leather industry, textile, trade. Again, overall composition has remained similar, more or less. So, what happens? The crisis that many other capital regions are facing. Recently, I was in Chandigarh, they were saying the same thing, that there is an economic crisis because some activities move out. Along with these activities, there are interrelated activities which are using the intermediate product. They also become non-viable, and that brings a crisis. In Ahmedabad, we had a serious problem because of the fixed pricing. But here what happens? Since the industries don't move totally away, the other interrelated industries are also staying. They're able to stay back. So while Delhi NCR has been able to attract modern frontline industries, as far as the traditional base is concerned, they have remained. There has been technological progress. But nonetheless, at the macro level, there has not been a significant change in the overall structure, and that, I think, adds to the strength of the NCR. And when Agrawal was talking about emulation, I think this is one message which we are giving, that is it possible? Because there are many industries which are labor intensive. If they were moving out, Delhi's inclusivity, Delhi NCR's inclusivity would have been affected, but they have not been kicked out completely. They are in the inner peripheries, in the outer peripheries, and that is what has really sustained inclusivity and efficiency. But I'll just take 2 more minutes, sir. You see, what Pratik brings out, there are some social issues of concern. You see, unemployment rate, you said, has gone up. It wasn't yesterday, this morning you were talking about what do the city can they offer? What the municipal corporations can offer? Certainly not employment, and not the large infrastructure. But I think at the city level, some kind of a proactive intervention can take place, provided they have some appropriate administrative status. I would like to tell you 26% of the urban population classified by 2001 census is under rural governance. And that is certainly constraining. We did find that within NCR region, there are a large number of census towns which do not have the basic amenities. And by the way, when the Registrar General of Census was asked to do a slum survey of the class 4, class 5, class 6 towns, they were not included in the slum survey in 2001. But I remember Kumari Shailaja, she said that, well, this has to be done, and Registrar General did it. You know how does it begin? It says, we surveyed these smaller towns, but the entire town can be called a slum. Basic infrastructure, and this is the statement coming from RGI. I'm simply saying these social problems that you talked about housing. Yeah, really, there are, we have taken indicators lately in housing, we do find that there are towns which are having problems. Although economic adjustment has taken place, the supporting infrastructure system has not come out, and that is something which is worrying. So the other point that Vijit was bringing in lately was this, employment for the woman. You see, Delhi NCR and Haryana, Rajasthan, where traditionally women workforce participation rate is not very high. But we were hoping that because of Delhi's proximity, their work participation rate for women would improve. But that has not happened. I think there are issues about, creating gender-friendly environment in the small and medium town within NCR. We do hear, different incidences which really perhaps bring down the women workforce participation rate, but that is another area of concern which has been identified. And finally, the detailed analysis of different sectors for future growth shows that Delhi is retaining those economic activities which are having a rapid growth, and globally also they are doing well. So that ensures efficiency and dynamism. Inclusivity is also being included, retained, because the labor-intensive industries have not been thrown out of the region as a whole. Although, as Rajit brought out, that tertiary sector predominantly comes in the core. Other manufacturing activities, including labor-intensive, have found place in the inner and outer peripheries. But what's the area of concern is that the industries which are growing rapidly are not the most energy efficient industries. That is the point of anxiety that, finally Vijit was concluding by saying that why couldn't we have a NCR planning board? I think without a major intervention from NCR DB planning board, economic structure has adjusted and saved Delhi from having a major crisis. But certainly the social aspects of development and the environmental aspect of development needs to be coordinated, and certainly a regional level planning body which can decide what kind of technology should be brought in the existing industry, what kind of new industry should be brought in with a more energy efficient industry. That has to be planned, and that is one of the areas of concern which has talked about. Sorry, I'm not taking more.
Thank you, Professor. So going in the webinar, we did a lot of conversations through this process. We spoke to all of the sort of industries in Meerut in a conversation. And nobody was thinking that they will be connected to Delhi in 50 minutes. And and nobody's having that conversation. And that infrastructure is going to be put, and then probably so there is no, so one of the things is just, I think, so 3 or 4 very specific things we saw needed to happen, like Modi Nagar, Meerut, 2 clear places, need to think about, what industry, at least so what is the economic development plan of those 2 places, because they're going to get connected. And just, so that was one thing, and again, how to facilitate that, and APP is also investing a lot in the R&D, but I think and that's where I think nobody ever has gone and spoken to
to the industry associations, to the actual, there's a sports good industry. Very entrepreneurial people, they're basically making sports goods for the whole country. But so how do you bring that together is sort of a cluster around sport. The other thing we spoke was almost all of the karigars, right? Whether it was chicken, is that they clearly needed, almost pretty much everybody needed like design support. And it's almost like, so then the second idea was this idea of anchor institution, right? Somewhere a design school that allows access to all of these people needs to come in that area. And again, how does that sort of, who takes the lead? I mean, NID in Ahmedabad is a great example of actually having an institution. Again, who takes the lead on doing this, right? I mean, we can even make a recommendation, but where does this go? So that was so this one was this sort of just focusing on the RRTS. Second is really looking at like design in digital and how do we enable a lot of the small businesses to be upskilled around this, and what kind of anchor institutions can drive that. The third thing was, it was very clear that as you got into the specifics, and it's quite easy, so Nilesh, we can easily make that data available for people to start digging deeper. Like the automotive sector in the Gurgaon Manesar area, there is no R&D happening all the R&D is happening in Bangalore. And it's not like the institutions are not there. It's almost a gender security problem. Nobody wants to live there who actually works in R&D. So it's about creating that neighborhood, that enclave, almost like an innovation district with the coffee shops that will attract the young people to stay there. Because the educational institutes are there. ICAT Manesar is there, which is the biggest testing facility. The industry is there, but R&D is happening in Bangalore. So how do we, I mean, again, who takes the lead on this? This is Haryana government probably. Same thing with Noida and the whole mobile phone cluster, right? There's just doing assembly, but it's happening at such a volume. There is that big JP institute, that 3 or 4 institutes. Can we create an innovation district or something where you start upskilling? So there were these specific ideas that clearly emerged, but again, it's almost like, who do you take these to and who will actually, these are all strategic projects, right? So it's very clear that 10 strategic projects immediately sort of fall into place. Who leads them? And basically the hollowing out the core, right? It's very clear the core, there's no job. I mean, as with these new restrictions, all of these people will move out, and all we are seeing is that becoming banquet halls. What's that strategy? I mean, I also don't know what should be the approach, right? I mean, what kind of industries should come, we don't know. So how do you first? So I think these few things we were struggling with. And so, if you have any thoughts on some of these ideas, whether these could be sort of also packaged and, found sort of clients necessarily to move them forward, because just doing these 10 things will dramatically also just create that list of strategic projects. Because 5 trillion, we realize 5 trillion Indian rupees worth of infrastructure investment has been done in Delhi NCR, which is incredibly high. It's about $70 billion. So, and somehow that is never linked to this economic development plan in a systematic way. So that was, these were some of the things that emerged. Also, we spoke to like a lot of the textile associations, we spoke to the sports goods people. We had a lot of these conversations with the auto sector, and all of them were saying that, we are struggling to attract people to do more high-end jobs. And they're all going to Bangalore. And pretty much the fundamental reason around that was gender security. And, again, whether urban design and whether small pockets can be then thought about to start to change that. But these were just some things that emerged more through the conversations that actually I participated, and less through the data. But I just thought I'll bring them up. And again, we were able to even identify the solutions broadly, but then how do you sort of move that forward? We didn't necessarily have a clear sort of position to make these recommendations. So again, any thoughts on that would be nice.
We will go for closing remarks now. And I'd like to go back in the same order so that, we use it. Yeah.
So I think what if and scenario building kind of lines of thinking would be very useful. A spatial analysis or the spatial coordination of data works fantastically as an analytical tool. It may not be very good as a policy prescription tool, right? Because policy doesn't have to follow that. And we see numerous examples of that. High value manufacturing happening in certain parts of the country where HDI is plummeting, those kinds of unfortunate sort of occurrences also happen. So I think we have to be very wary of determinism, and especially of spatial determinism, because that's precisely what creates the kind of aberrations or distortions that we want to avoid. So in a what-if kind of scenario, if the NCR is never, despite all of the aberrations that you see, runaway growth along the corridors and such like, peri-urbanization, despite that, highly productive, high GDP, per capita income is high. So what if you just improved the regulatory environment? What if what the ministry likes to call ease of doing business? What if you actually focused on ease of doing business so that there is more dynamism and vitality in new enterprises and their growth, right? So, or the transitioning of micro enterprise to maybe the next stage. So the what if is really useful, and perhaps stepping away from the spatial to look at policy prescriptions would be very useful, because the analysis is very, very useful, but it may not necessarily lead to policy.
I think the institutional issue is very important. And I would agree with Jagan that a corporation may not be the best way to do it. But what is the best way, I honestly don't know. But one thought is there a way of expanding the role of the NCRPP? Right now it's only planning, but can that role be expanded? Expanding the role by itself through a notification won't do. It needs the right kind of people to be posted there. I think something of that sort. The institution is important. I think I'll leave it to that. Sorry, having to rush off. But
Thank you very much, sir. I'll go to Rana in terms of final thoughts, barriers and, potential ways of entering this year.
I wouldn't say much. I think a lot has been said. Just two points. One is when you're thinking of future work, you're not just thinking of Delhi NCR, right? I mean, so in a sense, given the complexity of these institutional problems, why not take this up on a city region that is firmly within a state boundaries? Because I think these interstate things are just really complicated. I mean, we have difficulty even dealing with the inter-district stuff. So that would be my suggestion, number one. Number two, just a pitch, we've been trying to examine something and some possibilities, zooming in on the Meerut Delhi thing. I mean, this is an amazing new possibility, that the transport connectivity now to Delhi and then everything else that's going on. So it's really something we should look at, and the points you were making about how there are various groups, from the chicken workers to the more different types of work, and just bringing them together. That is something I hope we can carry that conversation forward. Third point is just, is it such a problem? If R&D is being done in Bangalore, production in Manasar, because there's this literature on functional specialization of cities, and in fact, I think in developing countries we see that everything tends to happen in the capital city, and partly that's probably because of bad use. Ease of doing business is much easier here. The infrastructure is better, but we do need dispersal. So in that sense, I was struck that maybe it's okay. That's what Bangalore is great at. Thank you. But overall, really enjoyed this report, and I think it really paves the way forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rana. I'll come to Parul.
Thanks. I just wanted to start with one point on the housing bit. I think it's important, since we are slowly acknowledging the importance of rental housing, to introduce that also as an anchor for economic development, because while capital is fluid, I think there's a way to also make the labor market more fluid by not locking people into this model of housing ownership. Which is important, which has a lot of other, important economic aspects to allow for exactly R&D experts from Bangalore to be able to come to Delhi when there's a new cluster of such a, specialization emerging. Then to the point that Madhav, we were talking about on what do we do with defunct cores. And I think this is again a place where urban planning and strategic planning can play a role, because it's very natural for cities to graduate from intermediary cities that were serving as industrial towns into a different type of economy, as economic development technology also changes its form. And a lot of good examples globally on how to leverage existing infrastructure, how to repackage, do adaptive reuse, brownfield remediation, things that are important. And in the last point is to also look at a more cascading approach to economic development plans, and where each of these hierarchy of plans serve different purpose, where you have a vision that is set up through a national or state level policy, but then as you go deeper down at a city level, where you're talking about what do we do with these entrepreneurs, these agglomeration, these clusters in a Meerut or in Modi Nagar. Well, this is where urban planning needs to have a chapter on economic development, perhaps not a separate economic development plan that looks at that integrated approach and informs the type of infrastructure investments that are being made into it. And how do we then I mean, as an urban planner, perhaps I'm a bit more biased, but I think this is where we need to look at different models of economic analysis. Not everything has to be data driven. We can do some quick analysis of supply chains and so on to understand the local economic agglomerations, clustering. And for small towns, perhaps that is more easier and suitable to do. So that would be my last point, to look at a more cascading approach to economic plans.
So we recently got into conversation with Gati Shakti, and what they're attempting to do is create area development strategies for many of the areas that they think, with the new pipeline of infrastructure investments that are going to happen across the country, what are those areas going to grow into as economic hubs, etc. And this is precisely what I was saying, zooming out. So while we think about spatialization of data and how spatiality of economy kind of matters to the way we plan, I think we have to constantly zoom in and out. I think it's, while we think about the core, we think about the periphery, we must also zoom way out and see what's really emerging. Are there larger strategies that need to be kind of put into place, which are much more macro in nature than looking at a city region. Just to come back to the question of granularity again, which I was stating earlier, by no means am I saying the data doesn't exist. I'm sure it does. And that's apparent in the report itself, that the data exists. What would have been interesting, for example, is, so if you go beyond Modi Nagar, you would also see entire villages that are processing plastic wastes, right? There are particular kind of spatial patterns emerging in particular kinds of sectors and activities. And it might have been interesting, even if we don't explore everything, but because somebody, and I think OP sir said that this can perhaps become the blueprint for how we do this in the future. Just saying as a phase 2, it might be an interesting experiment just to see what does a sector look like spatially. Just waste processing, what does that look like spatially across the NCR? Might just be an interesting exercise. When I said, could we have a little more spatialization in this exercise? That's the desire that I was really bringing to the table. That's all. Of course, there's data. How do we kind of begin to find different ways of representing this data spatially and seeing what kind of policy inputs we get for that might be very, very interesting to do as phase 2. I think it's a great start. Yeah.
The data is there at the granular level. We also haven't looked at it like you're saying, with specific lenses. And I think there's a lot of potential. Correct. And yeah, we just have to figure out what's the way to go in the instance.
Right. And last word to Jagan.
So I was just thinking, actually, you talked earlier about who should be the custodian or whatever it is that, the way of it. So we shouldn't forget the Commerce Department or Commerce Ministry, because they're looking at free trade agreements, they're looking at export issues, and those dynamics are actually going to they have begun to shape overall policy. So let's not forget them. And they are also the ones most involved in the regulation of enterprises and so on. So the Commerce Department is very crucial.
Just a quick question there, because industries department, like you mentioned, Rana, we've seen cities, industries, area development boards are coming in, taking large spaces of land for industrial purposes. but the rest of it, which is the urban, the housing, the public transport, none of that gets addressed. So I would say it's not necessarily the industry department, but where is that in between 6 feet spot between urban development and industry? Like how do we get there? Because that would be the preferred area.
Yeah, on that, I totally agree. I mean, I remember going to one big SZ, one of our biggest parks. It's about 40 kilometers from Chennai, and you can see, you go inside the park, it's beautiful. It's got toy factory relocated from China. It's got hydraulic excavators being made, etc. Step outside, and it's a mess. There must be a sense of village. In fact, I was trying to understand what is this place, from the what is the governance unit, and I think the answer was it is it's village. I mean, it's a complete mess. You have workers living in, they built four stories, and God knows, I hope they don't come crashing down if anything happens. But I think, people like it that way because they feel that, look, the moment you make this a municipality, there are all these disadvantages that come in. So I completely agree with you. In fact, I feel that until we get this equation right,
We'll never be able to get the full spillover benefits of these vibrant industrial parks. So I'm with you on this.
When we're talking about inclusive growth, out of the debate, if it gets anchored by an industrial, ministry that's solely focusing on industries, and I say this if it can be a bit more provocative, because we see the climate debate in India being anchored with the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, which has left a lot of other sectors out of, out of the, I mean, it does not have the same gravity of, focus from other ministries, because, it's an easy thing to say that it's not our mandate, it's Environment Ministry's mandate. So I think that's a political economy perhaps that needs to be thought through more clearly, and I have no
Because
no
we
ideas
also, we
on
also have
this.
this odd space we are stuck in where urban development says this is not their task, so industry says this is not their task. So whose task is it?
That's what I'm
Yeah.
suggesting. I think you need to put somebody. So I don't know what's the experience with the SI. They told industry to do that. And it's not that they're giving up on some stuff, but industry need somebody is got to try by or keep everyone at the same level. I don't think anything will get going.
Can I say just I think it's an anecdote, but just to show the agility and transformative capacity that comes from managing your regulatory environment. So to reflect on something I heard in the Netherlands, some 3,000 small structures which are on the side of bridges that go over canals in the Rotterdam region and the Amsterdam region, what they call the Randstad. All of them are being converted into single room hospitality businesses, which are going to be, so you can on an app actually rent that room, which is a serviced room. So it will be like serviced apartments, but they're all dotted all over this landscape. You could treat them as heritage conservation projects, but they're actually economic development projects, right? And it's covering the entire landscape, thousands of these, because now electronic and digital monitoring of water levels and the way in which the canals are working doesn't require a person to be there. And so they've just pivoted into turning these structures into hospitality businesses. Main point being that I think the industrial policy debate, I think Rana knows better than anybody in this room right now, is a big debate. Countries are really wondering whether industrial policy is the right way to go about it. But I believe strongly that getting the DNA, which really comes from the regulatory environment, which should be an enabling environment, right? It restricts what needs to be restricted, especially the externalities which you don't want, but it enables. And I think that enablement, this kind of an analysis can help us actually find what are those points that need to be enabled. That transformation perhaps along the highway corridors, that transformation in the peri-urban, but also within the core. What is it that
needs to happen in order to, for instance, make sure that your garments manufacturing in Gandhinagar is not polluting the Yamuna. We're not paying enough attention to that, because that kind of clustering, just as Taiwan has, thousands of small units that actually add up to an enormous economic powerhouse. We need to also think of that. Otherwise, we'll keep chasing the sort of the mega plant and those kinds of investments, whereas the DNA that's already creating prosperity, we don't pay enough attention to.
Thank you very much. Sir.
I thought I'll bring out some of the limitations of the study. I mean, using that word which nobody used, but you did mention about this. First thing that struck me, in fact, after the report was complete and this process was on for bringing it out, myself, Vijit and Madhav, we discussed it in a way informally. We have suggested that there are issues of social development, quality of infrastructure, quality of housing, quality of access to basic amenities in certain peripheral areas. This study has not been very specific in identifying the areas. Similarly, when we talk about industries which are not, energy saving, which is futuristic industries, again, we have not been able to pinpoint exactly. So that was much more bigger than this. I entirely agree with you. And also relation. That it is not only the statistical data supporting that. You have to have data we need, but qualitative information. You take certain sectors and find out what are the problems which are being created. So some of these conclusions that we have given, I think they need to be backed up with much more detailed analysis of qualitative and quantitative data, so that we can if you think of scaling it up at the national level, we are giving a general kind of an recommendation, but these studies need to be backed up. That is one thing. And second one that strikes me is that women's employment or informal employment, we are not having negative opinion about it. It's not a pejorative thing. But if you look at the PLFS data, periodic labor force data, you do find that the women annual employment are getting 26% less than the men. In labour employment, women are getting half of that of men, and in self-employment, they're getting 1/3. So that is the concern that we wanted to show, that in the informal sector and also particularly to women, they're certainly having serious difficulties in terms of the economic well-being. And what also is coming out clearly, that unemployment rate. It's just a new gift. Unemployment rate we talked about. We identify the skills where they need to be trained. Because migration is this. That's a good thing. I personally feel happy that Delhi's growth rate has become half during 2001 and 11. We don't know up to 2021 compared to 91, 2000. Because half the rate of growth is about 2%. Very low. But the migration is taking place. Unemployment is high. We have to back it up with some kind of skill development program, particularly in the inner periphery of the government. These are some of the specific things which need to count. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you very much. We're completely out of time. It's 4:20.